The Victorian Railways of Australia needed an engine that would be compatible to run on two different gauges, that being standard gauge and broad gauge. And with the success of the K-Class, a fleet of 280 consolidations, and with the recommendations of the Royal Commission, this ultimately led to the construction of the Victorian Railways N-Class, a fleet of 280 Makados that were built between 1925 and 1950, with 83 of them being built entirely from the Newport workshops and the North British Locomotive Works. The first batch of 20 would be built between 1925 and 1928, with the second batch being built between 1930 and 1931, all from the Newport Works, with a third batch of 50 being built between 1949 and 1950 by the North British as a part of the Victorian Railways' Operation Phoenix, a post-war rebuilding of the entirety of the Victorian Railways system. A fourth batch of 20 N-classes would be built by the Victorian Railways with a modified design. However, only 3 of them have been completed since production had ceased in 1951, and so the Victorian Railways opted to order more of the new designs of the 280 steam locomotives, otherwise known as the Victorian Railways' J-Class. They would be used on the branch lines across the Victorian Railways network, as the N-classes had an axle load as almost as light as that of the K-Class, as they would be seen pulling goods trains across the Victorian Railways network. During their later lives, the N-classes would be a common sight, assisting other locomotives on heavy wheat trains bound for the ports of Geelong and Portland. They would also be seen shunting around the yards across the western portion of the Victorian Railways network, such as Allarat and Mildura, for example. In 1951, engine number 430, a Newport-built N-Class, was set to haul the Centenary Jubilee train, a special train which would run all across Victoria, celebrating the centenary of the establishment of the colony of Victoria, and now the state of Victoria, and the jubilee of the establishment of the Commonwealth of Australia. This special train would consist of the engine, a van, and several carriages that were all painted in a special green and gold livery. And it would carry valuable artworks and manuscripts from the National Gallery of Victoria, as well as the Commonwealth's and Victorian's government displays. And it would make stops at 168 stations throughout its 6,000-mile-long journey from the 1st of February to the 30th of June of 1951. Meanwhile, along the west coast of Australia, the South Australian Railways were suffering through a locomotive crisis, and so the Victorian Railways had sold 10 of their North British-built N-Class locomotives and were sent to South Australia, eventually becoming the South Australian Railways' 750 class. Most of these engines hadn't really operated by Victorian Railways for a few days when they were all transferred over to the South Australian Railways, thus causing a reduction on the N-classes operating on the Victorian Railways, from 83 to 73 by the time of their withdrawals. These South Australian N-classes would be used on lightly built branch lines from Talem's Bend into Murray Marie, but they were very unpopular with the crews, ongoing due to their cabs being more cramped than the other South Australian built locomotives. With an industrial action occurring within the late 1940s threatening the coal supplies, the Victorian Railways converted 36 of the N-classes to burn oil starting from September 1951, before the program was cancelled at around 1956 due to the arrival of the diesel-electric locomotives. Speaking of which, when the brand new T-series of diesel-electric locomotives came onto the branch line scene in 1955, this set into the retirement of many N-classes. They were all put into storage and were only used on seasonal grain trains, with withdrawals beginning around 1965 and 1966. With the final run of the N-classes, number N468 and N475, hauling an Australian Railway Historical Society special train from Spencer Street bound for Burren, on October of 1966. Meanwhile in South Australia, the brand new 830 class of diesel-electric locomotives began to displace branch line steam power, with most of the 750s being withdrawn by 1962, and with the last one being cut up around September of 1967. As of today, only one of the N classes survived under preservation, that being N432, which is on static display at the Newport Railway Museum, and it is currently painted in a special green with gold livery for the Centenary Jubilee train from 1951. Meanwhile, in South Australia, SAR number 752 was the sole survivor of its class as it was placed on the Miles End Railway Museum in April of 1967 before later being moved to the Port Dock Railway Museum, which is now the National Railway Museum of Port Adelaide in 1988, and it is currently on display at the museum, having officially restored this year since then. Despite now being 2 of the N classes preserved as of today, as well as a 3rd one currently being under construction, the Victorian Railways' N class would continue on with their legacy as they dominated the Victorian Railways' network as the successor of the K class. It is enhanced that the N class will stay with us for a very long time.